Greetings and salutations, friends, to Vraks. In the aftermath of the attack of the 269th Regiment, which had shared the same fate as the 261st, shattered against the Vraksian defences. Albeit this offensive had not only cost the 88th a single regiment, but several more, as company-sized formations from the various other regiments and line corps had also been fed piece by piece into a futile attempt at breaking through the ravine leading up to the lower armory gates. The failed attack had cost the 88th almost a fourth of its infantry manpower in its line corps, in addition to countless armoured vehicles and Gorgon super heavy transports, along with 2 full companies of Death Rider cavalry rendered combat ineffective, and of course 150 battle brothers of the Red Hunters chapter killed or sacrificed to the dark gods of chaos. And when measured in scope, in time spent and in progress made, the attempt upon the lower armory gate was clearly the single most expensive defeat in the history of the Vraksian campaign. And if Lord Inquisitor Rex was not extremely careful, then his career and indeed even possibly his Rosetta might be the final victims of the battle. For whilst Inquisitors were indeed afforded the privilege to do with Imperial resources as they pleased, that privilege also came with the expectations that they would fulfill their objectives. And in this case, that was clearly not the case. And so, the Lord Inquisitor needed results, quickly, and now more than ever. Previously, he had certainly been on the clock to produce meaningful results, but the breakthrough of the outer curtain walls and the surrounding of the citadel had bought him a lot of time, a lot of leeway, and a lot of good faith in the higher-ups in the Imperium. His enemies could not move against him openly as long as he was producing results, and nobody had expected the siege of the citadel to be easy. But casualties like these were difficult to overlook, and so the Lord Inquisitor would have to produce something else for his political allies to focus upon, and for his enemies to be distracted by. The question, then, was what and how? Clearly, any further attempts upon the lower armory gates would be completely futile. The enemy had shown absolutely no signs of wavering, and had even used the Krieg pressure to preempt and annihilate the Lord Inquisitor's gambit with the Red Hunters. And thanks to the intervention of the Alpha Legion, the diversionary attacks against the Cardinal Gate had been met with almost equally crippling casualties. The enemy clearly had their eyes on the northern approaches to the citadel, and the approach up the winding pathway towards the Great Gate was still littered with the burned-out wrecks of the 5th Tank Column, and their assault in support of the 261st. It would take many days, if not weeks yet, for that path to be opened up sufficiently for any further attempts. This severely limited the Lord Inquisitor's options. He could attempt to assault the Greater Gate with a pure infantry force, but such a maneuver was unlikely to result in anything more than yet further pointless Krieg casualties. He could risk another move towards the Cardinal Gate, but now that that area had clearly been proven to be infested by Alpha Legion operatives and even the Legionnaires themselves, any further operations in that area would come at a severe risk of the forces being ambushed, separated, and annihilated. Lord Hector toyed with the idea that perhaps the Alpha Legionnaires could be countered by Loyalist Astartes. If each element of the Death Corps' forces were led in by smaller groups of Red Hunters led by inquisitorial personnel, then perhaps that might be enough to discourage the Alpha Legionnaires, or even possibly turn the tables on them. But this idea was rejected. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex knew that even the loyalties of a chapter like the Red Hunters, almost fanatical in their support of the God Emperor's Inquisition, had its limits, and the loss of more than a tenth of their chapter in a single operation was already sorely testing their relationship with the Lord Inquisitor. And should the Red Hunters, once again such a famously loyal chapter, decide to disengage from the field of battle, citing inept leadership, for example, that would almost certainly be the end of the Lord Inquisitor's command of the 88th. And as mentioned, another attempt upon the ravine was really not an option. True, the Death Corps was now in command of the outermost defences, they being held by what remained of the 269th, but with the enemy's full attention fixed on the ravine and the presence of the Steel Brethren, any further attempt upon it would be supremely bloody, and unlikely to achieve much, if anything. This left the Lord Inquisitor with only one option, and it was not a great one. It was to launch an attack against the lower gate spur. The 261st had attempted to attack it, but the assaulting force had run afoul of an ambush and been destroyed before they could make any real progress, even just towards the gate itself. But this was considered a minor setback, because, frankly, the lower gate spur was not considered a particularly vital objective at all. It connected the citadel itself to one of the laser defense batteries on the far southern edge of the citadel, but beyond that, it was more or less unconnected to the citadel itself. The connecting point leading into the main citadel and its secondary area connecting it to the northern defense battery could be blown up and disconnected at a moment's notice, so it was exceedingly unlikely that the Death Corps would be able to gain entry into the main citadel via that entrance. And even if they did, they would merely gain control over another ruined laser defense battery and nothing else, since the bridge connecting the small outspur citadel to the main citadel was also pre-rigged for destruction. And as for the gate itself, it was merely an outer defensive work. If it was broken, it would open up another area of approach to the citadel itself, known as the Pilgrim's Road. This was the primary point of entry towards the Basilica when the Vraks was still on Imperial hands. The road itself was long and steep, and covered by gun positions on the southernmost citadel walls. And once the Pilgrim Road had been climbed, the attackers would then have to break through the St. Leonis Gate, which was hardly any less defended than the Great Gate or the Cardinal Gate. By and large, the lower gate spur was a fairly unimportant objective, and would impart only minor benefit to the attacker if seized. It was, however, the least defended of the current objectives, at least presumably so. The 261st diversionary attack towards the lower gate had been halted by a well-prepared ambush before they could sound out the defences around the gate itself. But it was expected that the Vraksians would not commit considerable forces to defending such an unimportant objective. Though one could, with benefit, point out the fact that that was exactly the same kind of thinking that presaged the attack upon the gully as well. And knowing full well that he could not afford another mistake like that, the Lord Inquisitor took the somewhat radical decision to join the fighting on Vraks in person, where he could oversee operations and also bring his personal authority to bear far more easily. And the first step was to determine the viability of an attack upon the lower gate spur, and this time proper reconnaissance would be made beforehand. Time was most certainly of the essence, but a failure would be even worse than a delay. And so the Marauder Vigilance high-altitude reconnaissance variants were sent in to thoroughly investigate the lower gate spur and the possibility of any further surprises. And much the Lord Inquisitor's relief, the vigilance did not reveal any further unfortunate circumstances. The lower gatespur did indeed appear to be lightly held and lightly fortified. The pilgrim road as well appeared to be almost entirely clear of obstructions. This hinted at the potential of a large-scale chaos counterattack, since that was the only reason the Lord Inquisitor or any of his aides could possibly imagine for the road being left so completely open. But, well, counterattacks were a part of life on Vraks, and if it had to make its way all the way down the Pilgrim Road, then at the very least the Imperials would see it coming. And with the absence of any other obvious surprises, the lower gatespur was designated as the objective for the next offensive. And whilst the capture of the lower gate would hardly be a decisive advantage for the 88th, it would provide the Lord Inquisitor with a success story, something he could bring up whenever the failure at the ravine was mentioned, something to buy him time for greater, grander, and more decisive operations. But despite the somewhat limited goals of this offensive, no mistakes could be tolerated. If this attack ground down with excessive casualties, then that would most certainly be the end, and so Lord Hector Rex would bring to bear as much firepower as he could possibly acquire. Now that he was on the battlefield himself, he would be joining in personally, and as he himself was on the field, it would be far easier for him to wield his authority around. Previously, his attempts to get the cooperation of High Princep Drauka had met with some resistance. The Titans were, technically, well within the Lord Inquisitor's jurisdiction, but there are various legal niceties and rituals that must be observed, and any attempt that the Lord Inquisitor had made to get the cooperation of the Titans had usually been met with platitudes, nice words, and airy promises that never actually committed the Titans to any real action. A diplomatic dance, where the Titans of Legio Astorum sought to distance themselves somewhat from the Inquisitor due to the rather sudden nature of his arrival. And additionally, High Princep Drauka had established a surprisingly good working relationship with Marshal Arnim Kagori, and his sudden displacement from the top seat at the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army must have sat rather poorly with him. But now that Lord Hector was right there, in the same room, right in front of the High Principe, there was suddenly a lot less room for verbal maneuvering. And so, High Princep Drauka's own Reaver-class Titan, the Praetorian, along with two other Reavers, Tritus and Invictorus, would be deployed to the attack upon the lower gate, along with 4 Warhound-class Titans. This was a huge commitment from Legio Astorum, even more so as previously they had been very hesitant to ever commit any real Titan support to the Inquisitor's plan, only very grudgingly dispatching a single machine here and there to at the very least provide the impression that they were helping. But this was also a considerable risk for the Lord Inquisitor. By showing his authority so blatantly, he was essentially standing up to High Princep Drauka and telling him, "I am here now. I have authority, and if you make me do this without your support, and somehow I succeed, I will have my time, and I will use it to come for you." Such a threat, even indirectly delivered by a Lord Inquisitor, was nothing to make light of, even for a High Principe of a Titan Legion. But of course, should the attack fail, despite the support of the Titans of Legio Astorum, then Hector Rex would have neatly introduced the Forge Masters of Lucius and the Titan Principes of Legio Astorum into the ranks of his enemies, both politically and possibly otherwise. if one of the god machines of Legio Astorum was sacrificed in an attack that failed to achieve its objective, then that might see the Titans of Legio Astorum quit the field entirely, and they might even do so in a less than gracious manner, shall we say. The cooperation of the other elements of the 88th were easier to acquire. The Imperial Aeronautica forces would play a decisive role in the planned offensive, with their Marauder bombers being employed en masse in a scale that had very rarely been seen on Vraks before. The Imperial Aeronautica officers warned the Lord Inquisitor that to deploy their Marauder bombers with such frequency and in such mass would be less than ideal, especially since the Lord Inquisitor had the idea that they needed to bombard the lower gate spur specifically, which required precision bombing, which in turn meant that the Marauders would have to fly quite low to the ground, and therefore very exposed to the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses. Now, misunderstand me correctly, low altitude was still pretty damn far above the ground, but compared to the near stratospheric altitudes from which the bombers were delivering their munitions on a regular basis, this precision strike would have them fly practically nap of the earth as far as the enemy anti-aircraft defenses were concerned. Another unadvisable aspect of the plan was the sheer number of machines required. The Imperial Aeronautica was expected to put hundreds of Marauder bombers on the wings and have them attack the gate spur in waves. And whilst this would have been one thing if the Lord Inquisitor had been expecting the Marauders to bombard a large area, he was once again very specific in that this was to be an attack upon the gate and the walls themselves, which meant that the Marauder bombers not only had to attack from a relatively low altitude, as they did not have access to the valuable super-guided warheads of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and there was not enough time to acquire them in sufficient quantities, but also that the bombers would have to come in relatively small, organized waves. In an ideal scenario, all of the bombers would be set in against the target simultaneously, and they would simply blanket a vast area, but with such a relatively small target, they would get in one another's way. There was simply not enough airspace above the objective to deploy all of the 350-odd Marauder bombers that the Lord Inquisitor had requested, and so instead, they would have to come in 6 separate waves. And if the enemy's anti-aircraft defenses had not been awake during the first one, number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 would certainly be met with a warm welcome indeed. However, any and all objections on behalf of the Aeronautica officers fell on entirely deaf ears, and the order was given for the Marauder bombers to be prepared for their sorties. As for the Death Corps, well, he got a hell of a lot less objections from them. As far as the 88 were concerned, for the time being at the very least, the Lord Inquisitor was their supreme commander. And it's not exactly in the Death Corps' modus operandi to question instructions. One force that, however, stood out with its absence was the Red Hunters. The Lord Inquisitor would not request further large-scale deployments of the Astartes. Instead, the Red Hunters would continue to operate as the honor guards of various Inquisitors. And, of course, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex also requested his own honor guard of Red Hunter Astartes. Not that he really needed them. He had already received an honor guard from the Grey Knights, but there was no sense in offending anyone, particularly not with the currently delicate political situation. And speaking of the favoured sons of Titan, the most dedicated, skilled, and effective anti-demon force in the entire Imperium, what was to be the Grey Knights' role in all of this? They had shown that they were clearly quite hesitant to dedicate themselves to any overt action, not even when the Red Hunters were cut off and annihilated piecemeal by the deployment of demonic troops had they reacted. when the 261st was being cut to ribbons by a demonic counterattack, the Grey Knights had not intervened. They were husbanding their strengths. They were convinced that a large-scale demonic incursion was not only possible on Vraks, but downright likely, and they did not wish to thin their ranks or tip their hand overmuch before that main incursion and the architects behind it were made clear and vulnerable. But once again, Lord Inquisitor Hector X was not blessed with the luxury of biding his time. This attack would have to be decisive, regardless of anything and everything the enemy could throw at them, and with the Grey Knights being the Ordo Militant of the Ordo Malus, he could directly order them into the battle, and he made it very clear to their brother captains that he intended to do so. He made it clear that he would respect their superior tactical acumen in situations like this, but he also impressed upon them that if he was not successful here, then the Ordo Malus would almost certainly lose authority over the theatre entirely, to be replaced by the Ordo Hereticus, which would in turn almost certainly lead to the recalling of the Grey Knights. And to have them exit the battlefield with an active demonic threat still upon it, uncountered and unfought by the Grey Knights, ooh. Nothing short of spray painting their beloved chapter symbol with fresh and putrid discharge fired from a demon's anus could even come close to the shame of such a scenario. Suitably convinced, the Grey Knights promised that once the Lord Inquisitor called, they would appear to counter any enemy threats, be it demonic or otherwise. And so, with his forces marshalled, the Lord Inquisitor began preparing his plan. Well, if you can honestly call it that, his plan was to simply throw everything at the lower gate spur, including the kitchen sink this time. The 88th artillery batteries would all be concentrated on the gate spur. The Marauder bombers would be bombarding it with their own munitions. The Reaver Titans of Legio Astorum would be pounding it with their Apocalypse missile launcher and main weaponry. The 88th would then send in wave upon wave of Death Corps armor and infantry to continue to beat up on it. And this pounding was to simply continue until either the gate, the walls, or the 30th Line Corps broke. Whichever came first. On a subtlety scale of 1 to 10, this plan was probably -75, just a little bit short of the -98 of Lord Commander Julka's Great Push. The only things required there to make it into a full -100 was if Lord Commander Julka dropped flyers of the battle plan on top of the enemy before he actually started firing at them. But once again, one should never underestimate the problem-solving qualities of vast quantities of high explosives. And relatively speaking, the lower gate spur was one of the weakest objectives in the Citadel, outside of the protective umbrella extended by the Citadel's void shield generators. If there was any segment of the Citadel that could be breached simply just by throwing enough shit at it, it was this area. And the Lord Inquisitor certainly had marshalled an impressive amount of shit to throw at it. Whether or not it would be enough, well, that is what we are about to find out. The first attack upon the lower gate spur was, as planned, carried out by the Marauder bombers of the Imperial Aeronautica, with each Marauder bomber carrying its full complement of bombs. In 6 waves, they would pass in over the lower gates and deploy their ordnance, made up almost exclusively of dumb bombs, propelled towards their destination and guided by nothing more than velocity and gravity. Undoubtedly, the Lord Inquisitor would have done much to have access to one of the more specialized form of attack marauders at this point. A Marauder Colossus, for example, with its 10-ton guided munitions armor-piercing warhead, would have done an absolutely wonderful job of busting open the gate, not to mention several other areas of the citadel as well. Indeed, a Colossus bomb with its diamantite-tipped warhead might even have been able to bury its happy little way all the way down through the upper defenses of the citadel and down into the power banks of the void shield generators. But unfortunately, he didn't have a Marauder Colossus, nor did he have the time to acquire one, and even if he had the time, if he hadn't gotten one already, the Lord Inquisitor probably didn't know about this particular variant, and the aeronautica officers appeared to be disinclined to inform him of it. So instead, he would have to rely on good old-fashioned quantity. The wings upon wings of Marauder bombers would deploy 1,680 tons of high-explosive munitions to the lower gate spur. It was an awe-inspiring display of Imperial firepower, the likes of which even the Death Corps had rarely seen, but it had also come at a heavy cost. The Marauder bombers, flying so relatively low, were well within the anti-aircraft envelope of the Defender's weapon systems, and soon guided missiles and countless flak batteries opened up both from the lower gate spur, the laser defense silos, and the citadel itself. Soon the skies was crisscrossed with tracer and almost completely blotted out by the black, flowering explosions of flak detonations. The smaller caliber ordnance, and even most of the flak, was not an overt threat to the Marauder bombers. The workhorses of the Imperial Aeronautica could take quite a monstrous beating, but slowly the sheer weight of firepower began to tell, and first one, then a second, then a third Marauder bomber began listing dangerously, with engines on fire, crews wounded, or in some cases entire chunks of aircraft simply torn away from the hull. Many a Marauder bomber that day was brought down by 1,000 cuts, slowly but inevitably whittling away at the airframe, until the lumbering Leviathan could no longer stay airborne. Many Marauder bombers, even riddled with holes and with entire sections of the aircraft torn straight off it, still managed to limp their way back to the Imperial airfield. But many crews were also forced to abandon their Marauders, some still within range of the Citadel's guns, and the defenders showed no mercy to the slowly fluttering falling objects of parachutes with Imperial Navy crewmen dangling beneath them. And of considerably greater threat to the Marauders was the enemy's guided anti-air weaponry. Massive rockets tipped with malicious machine intelligence able to seek out the heat signatures of the Marauder bombers and guide its massive rocket-propelled warhead all the way up and after the bomber, detonating so close as to create a lethal shockwave, either outright pulping the crew or tearing the aircraft asunder. Out of some 350 Marauder bombers dispatched, a little over 200 made it back to base. And out of those who made it back, several would require days, if not weeks, of advanced, meticulous repairs, and a handful had to be scrapped even after having landed on the runway. Their damage so severe that it would be more expedient to cannibalize the wreck for any remaining working part rather than attempt to repair the whole. It had been an expensive day for the Imperial Aeronautica, but it had produced results. Unprotected by the void shield generators of the Citadel itself, the bombardment had been very effective. 4 separate breach points had been blasted in the lower gate spur, and 2 of the large armoured towers protecting it had also been smashed into unrecognizable piles of rubble. The main gate at the centre still stood defiant, but with so many alternative entries, it hardly mattered. And to see 4 large gaping holes smashed in the wall that they were about to assault, it must have been a real morale boost for the Death Corps of Krieg. The last remaining 2 regiments of the 30th Line Corps were both fully dedicated to this offensive, although at this point it was more like a regiment and a half after their various companies had taken a battering in the ravine alongside the 269th. The 30th was also beginning to run low on Death Riders. The previous 2 companies dedicated against the attack on the ravine had been so badly mauled that they now formed only a single, understrengthed company. In return, the 30th Corps would be well supported by armour, a full tank regiment being dedicated to this offensive, with yet further tank regiments standing ready to be released into the offensive if needed. Over 1,000 tanks, 400 Gorgons, and some 60,000 mechanized infantry. But those assault specialists would not be sent in the first wave. Instead, the first wave would consist of infantry elements supported by Leman Russ and heavy armour, Baneblades, Shadow Swords, and Macaria's heavy tank rumbling forward to provide close-in fire support to the advancing infantry. Unfortunately, the armoured elements may have been deployed a bit too early. Despite Lord Hector Rex being now in direct command on the battlefield, his lack of experience commanding elements of this size and complexity was showing once again. For when he ordered the armoured elements to move in support of the infantry, he had forgotten to take into account the simple fact that the terrain had been drastically altered in a very short period of time. Even though the Marauder bombers had been ordered to deliver their ordnance with a degree of precision, this was quite frankly an impossible request, with each Marauder bomber carrying some 4.8 tons of munitions. Dumping all of that in one spot is quite literally impossible, even during the best of times. And with the pilots and the bombardiers being hammered by a constant stream of flak, their precision had suffered somewhat. The area in front of the lower gate spur that had previously been relatively easily passable by armoured elements, consisting mostly of fairly flat areas, minor rock outcroppings, and the occasional wreck of the 261st Regiment's assault, was now a pockmarked moonscape, covered by hundreds of craters, some small, some huge, blasted out of the ground by 400-kilogram armor-penetrating bunker busters. Traversing this terrain would be a new, exciting, and interesting experience, no doubt, for the various tank crews, made all the more fascinating by the enemy's anti-tank defences. And so soon, the armoured spearhead that was supposed to push up quickly alongside the infantry and support them directly was almost all stuck floundering in various shell craters, with several tanks utterly immobilizing themselves, either by getting fully stuck in a deep crater or by throwing off their tracks. This put a rather sudden brake on the attack. The infantry was pushing forward regardless of the armoured elements, but with their support floundering behind them, they quickly ran into the same problems as most assaults on Vraks tend to do. Overwhelming amounts of enemy firepower being poured into them, and soon the infantry had to go to ground, and without the armour to suppress the enemy's defences, they were forced to stay low, move carefully, in short bursts from cover to cover, while seeking out whatever concealment and defence they could find. What was supposed to have been a rapid rush for the breaches soon turned into a painfully slow slog towards the enemy. But luckily, the enemy had not arrived unscathed from the heavy bombardment. The Marauders had done their job well, and with the destruction of 2 of the armoured towers, as well as the damaging or outright crushing of several of the bunkers and armoured parapets, the defenders found themselves in a bit of a pickle, where it was getting difficult for them to bring all of their weapons to bear effectively. Their carefully planned out interlocking fields of fire were suddenly torn right open as a bunker over there was destroyed by a bunker-busting bomb smashing right through its roof, detonating inside and slaughtering the crew. Whilst in other areas, bunkers had been partially collapsed due to the force of repeated impacts. and the carefully constructed routes with which the defenders could travel, both inside of the walls and behind them, in permacrete communication trenches, many of them as well had been blown skywards, making it far more complicated for the enemy to move their heavy weapons and their troops around, especially due to a second part of the barrage. The Death Corps' artillery was, of course, as always, hammering the rearward lines, and thud guns were firing upon the walls, seeing as the infantry assault had ground to a halt anyways, they might as well. But the truly heavy pieces here were not artillery or thud guns, but the Reaver-class Titans of Legio Astorum, who moved up and emptied their Apocalypse missile launchers into defenders one by one. The first Titan to do so was Invictorus, which had begun its bombardment of the defenders a moment after the Marauders had disengaged. The Invictorus was able to use its advanced fire control Auspex to target enemy positions even through the still-clearing fog of the bombardment, and engage them at long range with individual guided rockets, blasting open bunkers, annihilating gun ports, and targeting each piece of the defensive network as it came active. Whenever Invictorus noticed the flare of an anti-tank las cannon, its advanced Auspexes would detect it, target it, and fire a single guided Apocalypse missile towards it. If that didn't do the trick, a second or a third, until the weapon was destroyed. Whenever it saw the report of an autocannon or a heavy bolter fired from a bunker, it would do the same, dismantling the enemy's defenses gun by gun, bunker by bunker. After the gentle attentions of the Marauder bombers, and now exposed to this pinpoint precise bombardment, the enemy's defenses began to falter. Gaps opened up in their fields of fire, and the infantry began to seek their way forward once again, discovering weaknesses and openings and darting through them as quickly as possible. Casualties were still rising quickly, but compared to the attempts upon the gully or the ravine, this was nothing. Pleased with the progress, Lord Hector Rex decided to join the assault himself. Leaving the command bunker, he began to make his way towards the front line. He would demonstrate on this day that, whatever his failings were as a strategist or tactician, he was most certainly not a coward. But the Imperials would not have it all their own way. After expending all of its 20 Apocalypse missiles, Invictorus retired to rearm. A lengthy process requiring specialized equipment that could easily take hours at a time, as each individual Apocalypse missile would have to be loaded one by the adepts of the God Machines. This was also the sign for the Praetorian and the Tritus to move forward. Their own Apocalypse launchers fully stocked, they would engage the enemy defenses from closer in, making sure that their ammunition would count every time, and also allowing them to engage the enemy's defenders with their arm-mounted weaponry. The original plan was for the Titans to stay further back and support the armored thrust, but since it had gotten stuck in the craters created by the Marauder bombers, that no longer seemed like so much of an option. Praetorian would move forward and support the move against the main gate, possibly even engaging it with its main arm-mounted weaponry, whilst Tritus would lead the attack on the southern bastion, attempting to capture it, secure it, and therefore gain entry through which the gate itself may be captured by infantry. The southernmost laser defense bastion, just like the one to the north, was expected to have been knocked out by previous artillery bombardments. But whereas this intelligence had proven correct for the northern bastion, the southern one, albeit scarred from repeated bombardment and raids by Marauder bombers, was still very much so intact. The first sign that not everything was as it should was when the weapons moderati aboard Tritus reported an unusual heat signature to the Titan's front. There should be nothing in that direction capable of generating that kind of a heat signature. The Principe of Tritus immediately leapt into action and ordered the crews to begin scanning for enemy Titans. Perhaps Legio Vulcanum was finally going to show their hand. But after a handful of 10 seconds, there were no returns for enemy Titans on the Auspex. Confused and staring out through the eyes of the great god machine, the Principe of Tritus searched visually for targets, but he could not see anything until he discerned movement off in the middle distance. The massive blast shield on the southernmost laser defense silo was beginning to retract. And then it struck him. The laser defense battery was not dead. Immediately, in a sense of panic, he ordered the weapon moderates to lock all weapons on the battery and began ripple-firing the Apocalypse launchers in full auto mode. All 20 rockets would be leaving their housing in the Apocalypse launcher within seconds, but it was already too late. With the force of a small sun, the laser defense battery opened fire at point-blank range as far as Titan combat is concerned. The battery's grossly iridescent beam of laser energy reached out and for but a second contacted with the void shields of Tritus. In a shimmering deluge of light, the void shield flickered like a soap bubble set in stark relief, and for the merest millisecond it resisted the monstrous forces imposed upon it, before collapsing with the sound of thunder. As a weapon designed to engage spaceships in low orbit, impacted upon Tritus's armored carapace. Armor that had been designed to withstand the full firepower of legions of tanks for minutes at a time, buckled and ran like water within moments of the touch of the beam, which then reached effortlessly through the melting torso of Tritus and into its primary plasma reactor. Everything within 100 meters of the god machine simply disappeared, annihilated in the blast as the god machine detonated. And afterwards, for those who still had the sight to see, there was no sign that Tritus had ever been there. As for its brother and commander aboard the Praetorian, this was hard to miss. The detonation of Tritus, and hell, even just the firing of the laser defense battery, had set warning lights flashing throughout the Riva-class Titan insistently, and High Principe Drauka had immediately turned his own weapons upon the bastion, and with the aid of the Death Corps artillery also retasked to suppress the massive weaponry, the armoured cupola was brought down over the laser defense battery once again, the crew unwilling to risk a second shot against the Praetorian now that the god machine was fully aware that the laser defense battery was indeed operational. Unfortunately, the massively thick armoured cupola rendered it virtually invulnerable to the attentions of even a Riva-class Titan, and the continued bombardment from the heavy guns of the 88th were unlikely to penetrate its hide anytime soon. The northernmost bastion had been bombarded for a near 2 full months, and in that period it had finally been destroyed, but the 88 did not have that kind of time to deal with the southern one. And so, acting decisively, Lord Hector Rex decided to lead the assault upon the southern laser defense bastion personally, with a force consisting of himself, his honor guard, and Death Corps grenadiers released from the armored regiments. As Hector Rex made his move on the defense laser battery, the Death Corps at large continued to move towards the lower gate spur, with the enemy's defences having been much reduced by the fire of the Riva-class Titans and the Warhounds still stalking about the battlefield. They were finally beginning to make some serious progress, and the 30th Corps had managed to seize several of the breaches. Gaining entry into the wall itself and the innermost working of the defences, they were clearing it out section by section, whilst overrunning and destroying the last bunkers outside of the gate spur itself. It had taken the 30th Corps half a day to get to this point, but now that they were finally within the wall, within the enemy's own fortified positions, it seemed as if defeat for the Vraksian defenders was inevitable. And then, of course, the equally inevitable counterattack occurred. High above, from the main citadel itself, the St. Leone's Gate ground open, and armoured formations led by rhinos, land raiders and predator tanks, all painted in the dark black colours of the Brothers of Ares, began streaming down the pilgrim road. And they were not alone. They brought with them the warp-spawned abominations of previous attacks, but this time it was not the uncontrollable demons of the great powers of the warp. They had proven themselves uncooperative, unsuitable to anything other than concentrated attacks upon enemy formations, where the main force of the traitors were not deployed, lest their allies of the Immaterium grow unpredictable. Instead, the souls of various demons, now flocking to the immaterial space around Vraks, had been bound to the armoured carapaces of demon engines, defilers, dreadnoughts, blood slaughterers, and all manners of mechanical monstrosities. This terrifying battering ram of semi-living metal rolled down the pilgrim roads at unnatural speed. Defilers, dreadnoughts, and blood slaughterers all competing with one another to get into the fray first and begin reaping a bountiful harvest of souls, whilst the Black Brothers of Ares were hurrying in behind them as quickly as their rhinos and armoured personnel carriers could carry them. The elements of the 30th that had made it into the walls and through the breaches barely had more than a handful of minutes to react before the enemy was upon them. They had prepared themselves for a counterattack, but nothing could truly ever prepare one for the sheer savagery and speed of the demon-infested machines. A handful of las cannons, autocannons, and the occasional missile launcher was set up in all haste, in the breach, on the walls, and even out in the open. Every weapon was firing full tilt at the incoming wave of monsters, but it availed them little. The occasional beast was brought down, and here and there a machine abomination was peppered full of high-caliber rounds, sending pressurized blood firing out of it in all directions. But the fire, hastily thrown up to defend, was nowhere near enough to halt the impetus. And so the cavalcade of beasts slammed into 30th Corps and tossed them bodily back out through the breaches, slaughtering, devouring, and cutting them to pieces as it did so. But despite this counterattack, the Lord Inquisitor ordered that there would be no retreat. The 30th Corps was to continue to pour reinforcements into the lower gate spur, and armoured elements were to be recovered and brought up as quickly as possible. For the rest of the day, the 30th Corps continued to assault the breaches, continued to infiltrate the walls, and grenadier elements were brought up as well, to utilize their more powerful hellguns to support the guardsmen. Slowly, tanks also began making their way into the battlefield. Cresting the breaches, Lehman Russ' main battle tank climbed up and over them, pouring their own fire into the hordes seething beyond. Baneblades blasted their own path through the walls and entered firing from all weapons. The heavier pieces, Macarius and Malcadors, rolled forward unopposed, weapons blazing and tracks grinding mechanical monsters to red fleshy pulps beneath them. But the seemingly never-ending waves of living metal continued to swamp forward, drowning the tanks, ripping open their armoured hulls, and tossing their crews out to be messily devoured by the demon engines. 6 times the 30th Line Corps swept forward to reclaim the breaches, momentarily ousting the traitors and their horrifying compatriots, and equally so 6 times the Black Brothers and their demon machines swept forward and tossed the Death Corps back out again. And it would appear that the first day of this offensive as well would pass without a decisive victory to either party. The 30th Line Corps' officers began preparing for a disengagement maneuver through the night, but Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex countermanded that order. He instructed the 30th Line Corps to continue attacking throughout the night as he led further grenadier reinforcements into the bowels of the laser defense battery. He was growing close to the battery itself and its powered banks. If he could gain access to those, he could destroy the battery permanently. But if they retreated now, he feared that the progress made would be lost. He must have known that the 88th would be at a severe disadvantage fighting at night against enemy Chaos Space Marines and the Demon Machines. Blood-infused monsters of living metal driven by vicious and malicious supernatural intelligences, they did not need the light of day to discover their prey. They could smell their fear, taste their blood upon the wind, and locate their very life essence even in the darkest of nights. And yet, the Inquisitor commanded, and the 88th obeyed. The 30th Line Corps continuing to pour reinforcements into the attack upon the lower gate spurs, but men were being devoured at a frightening pace, not merely just rivaling, but even surpassing the rate of attrition when attacking the ravine. In the light of day, Imperial Guardsmen were no match for Chaos Space Marine, and even main battle tanks struggled to get to grips with the monstrosities constantly hoarding around the breaches. But in the middle of night, with visibility being severely reduced both for the infantry and the armor, very few of which were equipped with the kind of auspexes required to fight effectively during the dead of night, the 88's armoured and infantry elements were, for all intents and purposes, fully at the mercy of the heretics. All they could do was to activate whatever light they had, floodlights, flashlights, or even simply just firing off into the darkness to locate the enemy. But of course, every time they did so, the enemy also located them. But finally, during the dead of night, the Lord Inquisitor, his honor guard, and the grenadiers made it into the main power banks beneath the laser defense battery. Demolition charges were placed in copious quantities, and the Lord Inquisitor himself detonated them, finally putting the defense laser battery to rest, and gutting practically the entirety of the southern bastion with rolling waves of fire. At least the Death Corps would now be spared any further attention from its many automated weaponry and gun emplacements. But the night of horror was long indeed. For many a poor guardsman it would also be his last. And for those unfortunate enough to survive the night, it would haunt them, cripple them, and break even the spirits of Death Corps guardsmen. But finally, as dawn's first light began to stretch across the battlefield, the Lord Inquisitor ordered in the Grey Knights. And not a moment too soon, the 30th Line Corps was on the verge of complete collapse. But, seeing the brilliantly silver-armoured Land Raiders and Rhinos of the Grey Knights finally rush forward to engage the enemy, their hopes were buoyed up once again, and the defending fire reaching out from the lower gate spur to stop them was lackluster. The Black Brothers, having been engaged with the Death Corps, both guardsmen and grenadiers along with armoured elements, the entire night, had suffered. Their ranks had been thinned, and most of their Land Raiders and heavy weaponry had been destroyed. The life of each Black Brother claimed only at the cost of 100 or more guardsmen, and the demon engines were still swarming in vast writhing hordes around the breach points. But that was an enemy the Grey Knights were more than qualified to handle, with every single battle brother of the Grey Knights being a potent psyker in his own rights, and armed with a wide variety of anti-psyker and demon weaponry. They slashed through the demon engines as if they were barely even there, Nemesis force weapons effortlessly carving up the still living metallic hides of the monsters, and blasts of psychic energy sending screaming demonic souls hurtling back into the warp from which they came, tearing them apart and scattering them to the immaterial winds. The Black Brothers attempted to counterattack, but their own weaponry proved as ineffective against the Grey Knights as the Guardsmen's weapons proved against the Chaos Space Marines, explosive bolt rounds detonating harmlessly upon psychic shields, and even those who made it past did little more than scorch the massive, intricately crafted battle armor of the Grey Knights' Terminator squads, leading the assault in an unstoppable silver phalanx, pushing straight through the breach and sending the enemy fleeing before them, storm bolters chattering and cannons blasting out a continuous stream of purifying fire. The Black Brothers attempted a counterattack with their remaining armoured elements, but with Grey Knights' heavy support purgation squads taking up positions in the rubble, along with interceptor squads teleporting in behind them, and not to mention the 30th Line Corps rallying and following the Grey Knights in, the Black Brothers swiftly realized that if they wished to avoid sharing the fate of the demon engines, they needed to retreat, and swiftly as well. Still firing all the weapons available to them, and backing slowly up the Pilgrim Road, the Black Brothers, mounted aboard their remaining vehicles or on foot, began to retreat, whilst being constantly harried by both the Death Corps and the Grey Knights firing up at them. The Lord Inquisitor also ordered the heavy artillery to begin blasting the road wherever they could. But soon, the Black Brothers was back safely behind the Void Shield-guarded citadel walls. Nevertheless, the Black Brothers had taken a severe mauling. Much of their armor was left smoking and burning on the battlefield, and many of their brothers would never oppose the Emperor's faithful servants ever again. And most importantly of all, the end of the second day's fighting, brief as it had been, saw the Imperials in command of the Lower Gatehouse Spur, although precious little of it remained. The gatehouse itself was little more than a pile of rubble. All of the armoured towers had been reduced to nothing more than scattered remnants, and the wall, which began the night with 4 massive breaches blasted in it, was now more a series of broken shards, jutting out of the ground at uneven intervals, than any true wall. But still, the Lord Inquisitor had got his objective. The lower gate had been seized, and with this, the first victory against the final Vraxian citadel had been achieved. But at what a cost! The Lord Inquisitor's insistence on a round-the-clock assault had ground the 30th Line Corps to dust. Out of the 2 remaining regiments, after the sacrifices of the 269th and the 261st, the 30th had begun the assault upon the Lower Gate Spur, with 2 regiments remaining. At the end of this, the second brief day of combat, after a hellish night of slaughter the Death Corps had rarely seen before in its entire history, only a single understrength regimental formation could be created. For all intents and purposes, the 30th Line Corps had ceased to exist. And thusly, Lord Hector received the dubious honor of being the first commander of the 88th to see an entire line corps destroyed under his command. And with its destruction, the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army had been much reduced. The Inquisitor had his objective, but whether or not it had been bought at a price that he could truly afford was something that was yet to be proven. But luckily for the Lord Inquisitor, he was about to receive the first piece of good news in a very, very long time indeed. as old friends announced their return to the Vraxian theatre. As to who that may be, well, to find that out, you're going to have to wait until the next episode. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening and watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. And, of course, if you know anyone who might be interested in a series like this, please do consider sharing the word around. It helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate it. Until then, have a good day. And then, despite saying that, I do feel the need to add in a short little addendum all the way at the end here, but I felt I had a good outro there, so I didn't want to ruin it, although I am kind of ruining it now. So, 4 full companies shattered at the end of this. Mind you, in the actual Siege of Vraks book, those 4 companies were all supposed to belong to the 269th, which had already lost another 4 companies from a regiment that only actually has 4 companies. And that's not taking into consideration, by the way, the various diversionary attacks. So, yeah, but this presentation I did here made more sense in my opinion. After the defeat on the ravine, the Lord Inquisitor would simply just take whatever was left of the 30th Line Corps and toss it at the objective that was the Lower Gate Spur, being identified as the easiest to achieve objective, both so that he could actually present some form of progress to his superiors, and so that he could use it in his own little propaganda, basically as a way of saying, hey, look, I've actually done something, somewhere, somehow. And his personal arrival on the battlefield also is a moment of far more drama, I feel, than what it was presented as in the book. In the book, he kind of just, shows up. He's just mentioned as watching the assault upon the ravine, whilst also watching the assault upon the Lower Gate Spur, which, I mean, he literally can't, because he'd, again, be on 2 different sides of the battlefield. But considering the 269th apparently cloned all of its guardsmen and deployed them twice over, I guess it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility that the Lord Inquisitor also cloned himself. God only fucking knows. But still, I feel like this was a much better way of doing it, and with the second hour-long video, we are pretty much at the very end here. This chapter that I took this off is in fact titled The First Victory of the Final Battle for Vraks, so buckle up, boys, we're just about there. But now, once again, until next time, have a good day.